At 83 years old, Carole King sat with the weight of a lifetime behind her, a lifetime of melodies that taught the world how to love, how to ache, how to forgive, and how to survive heartbreak. And yet behind the soft voice that once carried entire generations through their most intimate moments, there remained a truth she had guarded for decades, a truth so sharp and unresolved that even now it startled those who heard it. Because when Carole King finally admitted, "I utterly hated him," it shattered the comforting myth that the woman who wrote some of the most tender love songs in American history had lived a life untouched by bitterness or rage. For years, fans believed her music was born purely from empathy and romantic longing. But what if the songs that felt like warm embraces were actually written as shields, as escapes, as quiet acts of emotional survival? And what if the man she hated most was not a distant villain but someone once inseparable from her heart? This video is about truth delayed by fear, about silence chosen in an era that punished women for honesty, and about how a creative genius carried resentment so heavy that it quietly shaped her art while the world applauded without ever seeing the cost. Stay with me until the very end, because the final realization does not just change how we see Carole King, it changes how we hear every song she ever wrote. To the public, Carole King was warmth personified, the woman at the piano with a voice that felt like a conversation late at night, the songwriter who seemed to understand human vulnerability better than anyone else, and for decades her image was inseparable from sincerity and emotional generosity. Songs like You've Got a Friend and So Far Away did not sound like the work of someone carrying anger. They sounded like reassurance, like emotional shelter, and that was precisely why the idea of hatred felt so incompatible with her legacy. Yet those closest to her knew that the calm exterior masked a life that had demanded resilience at every turn, a life built inside an industry that praised her talent while often dismissing her autonomy. And from the very beginning Carole learned that to survive, she had to be agreeable, productive, and quiet about her pain. The music world adored her output, but it rarely asked how she felt creating it, and in that silence, resentment had room to grow. This chapter is essential because it establishes the contradiction that defines her story. How could someone so deeply associated with love carry such profound resentment? And how long can anyone live as a symbol before the truth begins to suffocate them? Carole King was barely out of her teens when she stepped into the Brill Building scene in New York, a place that functioned like a hit-making factory where talent was abundant but power was concentrated almost entirely in the hands of men. She was brilliant, disciplined, and musically fearless, yet she entered an environment where young women were expected to write, smile, and comply, not question the structure that controlled their careers. It was here that she met the man who would become both her greatest collaborator and her deepest emotional wound, a partnership that began with shared ambition and creative chemistry but slowly transformed into something far more complicated and damaging. At first, the collaboration felt like destiny, two young creators feeding off each other's ideas, but beneath the surface, control, ego, and emotional imbalance began to define their relationship. Decisions were made for her, credit was unevenly distributed, and her voice, both literally and metaphorically, was often filtered through someone else's authority. The foundation is laid for understanding how resentment is not born overnight but accumulates quietly through repeated dismissals, betrayals, and compromises that a young woman is told are simply the price of success. Carole King did not yet call it hatred, but the seeds were planted here, in rooms where her talent was celebrated while her personhood was slowly diminished, and in choices she felt pressured to accept because the alternative was losing everything she had worked so hard to build. The man Carole King would one day admit she utterly hated was not a stranger who passed briefly through her life. He was woven into nearly every corner of her early adulthood, her creativity, and her identity as an artist. Gerry Goffin was her husband, her lyrical partner, and for a time, the other half of one of the most successful songwriting teams in American music history. To the outside world, they were a fairy tale collaboration, young, brilliant, prolific, and seemingly inseparable, writing hit after hit that defined an era. But inside their private life, the balance was never equal. Goffin was charismatic, volatile, and increasingly reckless, while Carole was grounded, emotionally attentive, and endlessly responsible, not just for the music, but for holding their world together. As their success grew, so did the emotional distance between them, and the cracks that first appeared as stress soon widened into something far more painful. Goffin's infidelities were not rumors whispered later in hindsight, they were lived realities that humiliated her repeatedly, often while she continued to show up to work, to write, to create, and to perform as if nothing was wrong. What made the damage deeper was that the betrayal did not stop at their marriage, it seeped into their creative partnership as well. Carole was expected to keep producing brilliance while absorbing emotional chaos, to separate her pain from her productivity, and to remain composed while her personal life unraveled in public and private. Over time, love eroded into resentment, and resentment hardened into something she was afraid to name. This was not hatred born of cruelty, but of exhaustion, of being asked to forgive endlessly while receiving little protection or accountability in return. By the time their marriage began collapsing, Carole King was no longer trying to save the relationship, she was trying to survive it. The emotional labor required to coexist with someone whose behavior was unpredictable and often destructive took a toll that could not be undone simply by success or acclaim. She internalized anger because expressing it felt dangerous, not just to her marriage, but to her career, her reputation, and her sense of stability in an industry that already favored men who were difficult while punishing women who were honest. As the partnership deteriorated, Carole found herself trapped between loyalty and self-preservation. Walking away meant risking the very foundation of her professional life, yet staying meant sacrificing pieces of herself she would never fully recover. It was during this period that her songwriting began to shift subtly, not in obvious bitterness, but in depth, in emotional complexity, in a quiet acknowledgement of loneliness that listeners would later recognize without ever knowing its source. This was the stage where hatred quietly took root, not as a dramatic explosion, but as a slow-burning realization that the person she had trusted most had also caused her the greatest harm. Years later, when she finally used the words "I utterly hated him," it was not a denial of the love that once existed, but an honest reckoning with what prolonged betrayal does to a human heart. In this chapter of her life, Carole King learned that silence could keep the peace, but it could never heal the wound, and that realization would follow her long after the marriage ended, shaping not only who she became, but how the world would eventually come to understand her truth. By the early 1960s, Carole King's name was quietly attached to some of the biggest hits in America, songs that poured out of radios and jukeboxes, songs sung by voices far more famous than her own, while she sat behind the scenes carrying both the triumph and the toll. From the outside, it looked like a dream life, chart-topping success, financial stability, industry respect, but behind closed doors the cost of that success was growing heavier by the day. She was writing while emotionally depleted, creating melodies under pressure, deadlines, and domestic chaos, often working through nights after absorbing personal wounds she had no space to process. Public celebrations rarely matched private reality. When a song succeeded, the spotlight often shifted toward performers or toward Gerry Goffin's lyrical bravado, while Carole's role, the musical backbone of it all, was quietly taken for granted. She was praised, yes, but not protected, not centered, not asked whether she was okay. Over time, the imbalance created a profound sense of invisibility, the feeling that her contributions were essential but her emotional needs were optional. This invisibility did not just sting, it reshaped how she saw herself, planting the idea that her value was tied only to what she could produce, not to who she was. Success did not bring relief, it brought isolation. The higher the songs climbed on the charts, the lonelier she felt at home, and the more she learned to compartmentalize pain, pushing it down so deeply that it could not interfere with her work. This was not resilience born of strength alone, it was endurance born of necessity, and the longer it continued, the more resentment solidified into something she could no longer pretend was temporary. There are betrayals that pass with time, and then there are betrayals that permanently alter the way a person understands trust. For Carole King, the repeated infidelities and emotional abandonment were not isolated incidents. They were patterns, each one reinforcing the painful truth that she was expected to forgive endlessly while carrying the consequences alone. What made the betrayal so devastating was not just the personal humiliation, but the professional entanglement that made escape feel impossible. The same man who hurt her was also tied to her livelihood, her creative identity, and her public narrative. At a certain point, the pain stopped feeling acute and began to feel permanent. She no longer confronted it because confrontation offered no resolution, only more instability. Instead, she internalized everything, absorbing the damage quietly, believing that endurance was the only way forward. This was the moment when love finally collapsed under the weight of reality, replaced by emotional distance so vast that it could not be bridged even after separation. Years later, when she reflected on this period, the words "I utterly hated him" were not an exaggeration. They were the language of someone finally allowing herself to acknowledge how deeply she had been wounded. The hatred was not sudden or explosive, it was cumulative, formed by years of betrayal that were never fully addressed, never healed, and never given the dignity of truth at the time they occurred. To understand Carole King's silence, you have to understand the era she lived in. In the 1960s and 1970s, women in the music industry were expected to be grateful, compliant, and emotionally accommodating, especially when success had already come their way. Speaking out was not seen as bravery, it was seen as ingratitude, bitterness, or professional suicide. A woman who complained risked being labeled difficult, while a man exhibiting the same behavior was often excused as creative or complicated. Carole understood these unspoken rules instinctively. She knew that telling the truth could cost her collaborators, opportunities, and credibility, and so she chose silence not because she lacked courage, but because she was trying to survive. Silence became a shield, a way to maintain stability for her children, her career, and her fragile sense of control in a world that offered little protection for women who challenged powerful men. What the public interpreted as grace was, in reality, restraint born of fear and calculation. Each interview where she smiled, Each moment she deflected personal questions was another instance of choosing survival over catharsis. The cost of that choice would not be fully realized until decades later, when the weight of unspoken truth finally demanded release, and when Carole King, no longer bound by the same expectations, allowed herself to speak with a clarity that younger versions of herself were never permitted to have. Long before Carole King ever spoke the words out loud, she was already telling the truth in another language, the language she trusted most. Her songs became confessions she could not yet make in conversation, emotional documents disguised as love songs, where pain was softened by melody and anger was translated into longing. Audiences heard tenderness, but beneath that tenderness lived grief, disappointment, and the quiet recognition that something once sacred had been broken beyond repair. In retrospect, many of her lyrics read less like declarations of romance and more like negotiations with loss. Lines about distance, emotional absence, and the ache of unmet needs were not abstract ideas. They were lived experiences filtered through restraint. Writing became the one place where she could be honest without being punished, where she could process betrayal without naming its source. Each song carried fragments of what she could not say directly, allowing her to release emotion while maintaining the public image expected of her. What makes this chapter so haunting is the realization that millions of listeners found comfort in songs that were born from unresolved pain. While the world sang along, Carole was quietly working through resentment she could not yet confront openly. The music was not an escape from her feelings, it was the only place they were allowed to exist, and over time, those hidden confessions accumulated into a body of work that now sounds profoundly different when heard through the lens of what she endured. Leaving the marriage and the songwriting partnership marked a turning point, but it was not the clean break many imagine. Carole King's move toward independence and solo success was courageous and necessary, yet freedom did not arrive instantly with separation. Emotional damage does not disappear simply because circumstances change, and the wounds she carried were far too deep to be erased by professional achievement alone. Her solo career brought her into the spotlight as a performer, a role she had once avoided, and albums like Tapestry cemented her status as an icon in her own right. On the surface, it looked like triumph, a woman reclaiming her voice and her narrative. But beneath the acclaim, unresolved feelings lingered. The resentment she had suppressed did not vanish, it matured, becoming quieter, heavier, and more introspective. Hatred for her was not explosive or dramatic, it was something she lived with, something that shaped how she trusted, how she guarded herself, and how she understood intimacy. Breaking away allowed her to breathe, but it did not undo the years of emotional compromise. Instead, it gave her the distance needed to eventually understand what she had endured. The success that followed proved her talent beyond doubt, yet it also underscored how much she had survived to get there, and how little space she had been given to acknowledge the cost at the time. As decades passed, the world celebrated Carole King as a legend, honoring her contributions, replaying her songs, and framing her story as one of resilience and artistic triumph. Publicly, the narrative felt complete, a woman who had found her voice and her peace. Privately, however, there were truths she still carried alone. In interviews, she sometimes came close to revealing more, pausing before answering personal questions, choosing careful language that hinted at pain without fully exposing it. There were moments when the truth hovered just beneath the surface, when a single sentence could have changed the entire narrative, but each time she pulled back. Old instincts remained powerful. Decades of learning when to stay silent do not disappear easily, even when the consequences of speaking have lessened. The burden of unspoken truth became familiar, almost routine, yet no less heavy. For most of her life, Carole King had been placed on a pedestal that left little room for complexity. She was expected to be gentle, gracious, endlessly understanding, the embodiment of emotional generosity both in her music and in her public persona. Fans wanted her to be the woman who always forgave, who turned pain into beauty without ever showing anger, but that image, however comforting, was never fully human. Behind it lived a woman who had felt rage, disappointment, and deep resentment, emotions she was taught to suppress because they did not fit the story the world preferred to tell about her. Admitting anger felt almost like a betrayal of her own legacy. She worried about how it would sound, how it would be interpreted, and whether it would diminish the meaning people had attached to her songs. For decades, she carried an internal conflict, the truth of her experience versus the fear of being seen as bitter or ungrateful. Even in old age, honesty felt dangerous, not because of professional consequences anymore, but because it threatened a lifetime of carefully maintained grace. Something changes when you reach your 80s. Time no longer feels theoretical, it becomes immediate and finite. For Carole King, this awareness brought clarity rather than fear. The questions that once kept her silent lost their power, replaced by a simpler, more urgent one. What truths do I not want to carry with me any longer? With distance came perspective. She could finally see her younger self not as weak for staying silent, but as a woman navigating an unforgiving world with the tools she had at the time. This compassion allowed her to revisit old memories without self-blame, and in doing so, she found the courage to name what she had endured. The reckoning was not loud or dramatic, it was deeply internal, a moment of acceptance where denial no longer served a purpose. When she finally allowed herself to be honest, the release was palpable. It was not about reopening wounds, but about acknowledging they had existed at all. Speaking the truth did not erase the past, but it loosened its grip. For the first time, she did not feel obligated to protect anyone else's image at the expense of her own emotional reality. That freedom, arriving so late in life, was both bittersweet and profoundly healing. When Carole King said the words, "I utterly hated him," they landed with such force because they were so unexpected. Coming from a woman associated with empathy and warmth, the statement felt jarring, almost transgressive. But those words were not chosen impulsively, they were precise, deliberate, and deeply considered. She was not rewriting history or denying the love that once existed, she was finally naming the emotional truth of what prolonged betrayal had done to her. What she meant was not hatred in the simplistic sense of rage or revenge. It was the kind of hatred that grows from repeated wounds left unacknowledged, from years of being asked to endure without protest, from love that demanded too much and gave too little in return. By using those words, she reclaimed the right to define her own experience, rather than allowing others to soften it for their comfort. Equally important is what she did not mean. She was not asking for judgment, nor was she seeking to diminish the music they created together. Instead, she was drawing a clear line between artistry and emotional cost. The difference between hatred and unresolved pain is honesty, and in that moment, Carole King chose honesty at last. The shock was not that she felt this way, but that she finally allowed herself to say it out loud. When Carole King finally spoke with honesty about the man she hated, she was not dismantling his public reputation so much as separating it from her private reality. To the world, Gerry Goffin was a gifted lyricist, a brilliant collaborator, a man whose words helped define a generation of pop music. To her, he was something far more complicated and far more painful. He was the person who stood closest to her during her most formative years, the one who knew her vulnerabilities intimately, and the one who repeatedly used that closeness without offering the safety it required. In private, the relationship was not the romantic partnership fans imagined. It was a cycle of emotional imbalance where she became the stabilizer, the caretaker, the one who absorbed chaos so the work could continue. His behavior, his absences, and his betrayals came to represent more than personal hurt. They became symbols of how easily her needs were dismissed, how often her endurance was mistaken for consent. Over time, he stopped being just one man in her story and became a stand-in for a larger pattern of being unheard and unprotected. What she hated, ultimately, was not only him, but what he represented in her life: the normalization of sacrifice without reciprocity, the expectation that her talent could flourish while her emotional well-being quietly withered. By naming her hatred, she was reclaiming the right to define that chapter of her life on her own terms, no longer softened by nostalgia or filtered through someone else's narrative. Carole King's story does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger truth about how the music industry functioned for decades, particularly for women. Talent was celebrated, but autonomy was negotiable. Power protected itself, not the people who produced the art. Men were forgiven for volatility, infidelity, and excess, while women were encouraged to be accommodating, patient, and grateful simply for being allowed into the room. In this environment, silence became generational. Women learned from watching one another that speaking out rarely led to justice and often led to erasure. Careers could stall, collaborations could vanish, and reputations could be quietly damaged. Carole's decision to stay quiet was not a personal failure, it was a rational response to a system that made honesty costly. Her experience mirrored that of countless female artists whose stories remained untold, buried beneath hit records and smiling publicity photos. By finally speaking, even late in life, she exposed not just a personal wound but a structural one. Her truth forces a re-evaluation of how many beloved songs were created under conditions of emotional compromise, and how many voices were muted to keep the machinery of success running smoothly. In telling her story, Carole King became part of a broader reckoning, one that asks the industry to confront the human cost behind its greatest achievements. One of the most persistent questions surrounding Carole King's admission is whether she ever forgave the man she hated. The answer, like her life, is not simple. Forgiveness, for her, was never about absolving harm or pretending it did not matter. It was about releasing herself from the obligation to carry someone else's weight indefinitely. Hatred and peace, she came to understand, are not always opposites. Sometimes they coexist during the long process of emotional clarity. Closure did not arrive in the form of reconciliation or mutual understanding. Instead, it came through honesty, the willingness to name what had happened without minimizing it. By acknowledging her resentment, she did not reopen old wounds, she allowed them to finally breathe. Emotional freedom, for Carole King, was not found in rewriting the past, but in refusing to lie about it any longer. Once Carole King allowed herself to be honest about the resentment she carried, her entire body of work seemed to rearrange itself in retrospect. Songs that had long been celebrated as gentle expressions of love suddenly revealed deeper layers, not contradicting their beauty, but expanding it. What once sounded like simple tenderness now felt like endurance, like a woman holding herself together through melody when words were too dangerous to speak aloud. The music did not change, but our understanding of it did, and that shift is irreversible. Re-listening to her catalog with this knowledge transforms familiar songs into survival stories. Lyrics about distance, patience, and emotional longing no longer feel abstract. They feel like lived testimony. Moments that once sounded hopeful now carry the weight of someone trying to believe in connection while quietly recognizing its absence. This does not diminish the love in her music. It reveals the strength required to write with compassion while feeling wounded. In finally naming her pain, Carole reclaimed ownership of her legacy. Her songs are no longer misinterpreted as proof that she was untouched by anger or disappointment. They stand instead as evidence of her resilience. The confession reframes her work not as naive optimism, but as hard-earned empathy, and in doing so, it elevates her artistry to something even more profound than audiences originally understood. Carrying resentment for decades leaves marks that are not always visible, but they are deeply felt. For Carole King, the emotional weight was not just about one relationship. It was about years of suppressing her own truth to maintain stability, harmony, and success. Silence became a habit, then an identity, shaping how she moved through the world and how she measured her own worth. The cost of that silence was cumulative, slowly shaping her emotional landscape in ways she could not fully articulate until much later. Looking back, she recognized how deeply silence can shape a person. It teaches restraint, yes, but it also teaches self-erasure. By choosing not to speak, she protected others while gradually diminishing space for her own feelings. This realization brought with it a quiet grief, not for lost success or missed opportunities, but for the younger version of herself who believed endurance was the same as strength. If there is wisdom she wishes younger artists could inherit, it is this: talent should never require emotional self-sacrifice as its price. Pain does not automatically make art better, and silence should never be mistaken for grace. The wisdom earned through her experience is not bitter, it is compassionate, shaped by understanding both the necessity of survival and the importance of truth. Her story becomes a caution, but also a reassurance that it is never too late to reclaim your voice. The question many ask is why Carole King chose to speak now, after so many years of silence. The answer lies partly in cultural change. The world has slowly become more willing to listen to women's truths, more capable of holding complexity without demanding politeness or emotional restraint. What once would have been dismissed as bitterness is now recognized as lived experience, and that shift mattered. It created a space where honesty felt safer, even if it still felt vulnerable. Age itself became a form of liberation. At 83, the pressures that once governed her decisions had loosened their grip. There were no careers left to protect, no narratives left to uphold for the comfort of others. What remained was a simple priority: truth. She no longer felt obligated to soften her story or protect anyone else's image at the expense of her own emotional clarity. Most importantly, she did not speak for revenge. Her words were not an attempt to reopen old conflicts or rewrite history in her favor. She spoke for release. After a lifetime of carrying what could not be said, she chose honesty as a final act of self-respect. In doing so, Carole King did not diminish her past. She completed it, closing a long chapter not with bitterness, but with truth finally allowed to exist in the open.